This is an easy do-it-yourself project, making miniature faux replicas or representations of a cooling rack, flat sheet pan, a silicone baking mat, and hot pan holders from plastic canvas, cardstock, food vacuum wrap, fabric, and paper, in several scales for display. Materials and suggested supplies are shown in the video and listed below. Here are some of the size approximations that I used, but choose the scale and measurement you need. Consider the final placement too, including if it's going to be on a table or the counter size. To make the 1/12 scale, I'm using the 7-count plastic canvas, and I count over 13 by 8, and that's the piece I'm going to cut out. For the cooling rack, of course you can make adjustments and make it the size that you'd like. You can use scissors or your craft knife to cut your plastic canvas. Once you have the piece cut out, you can trim off with your scissors or craft knife any extra little supports pieces that are kind of around the edges. Now I'm going to cut out on either edge the little supports, not the very end ones, but all the center ones. So I have to do the top, make a little cut, and then I turn it around, and then I start to make a cut on the other side. This step can be eliminated. You don't have to do it. And I do show you a little bit later on one of the baking racks that I did not cut out the supports for. The piece on the left has not had the supports cut out on either side. And then for comparison, the one on the right does show it being cut out. Next, bend those end pieces. I'm using a tweezers and just kind of pushing it down. Then I press it with my fingertips for both ends. And when the cooling rack has been bent, it just has a slight little angle for those ends. Another idea here is the 5-count. You could go ahead and mark the little support pieces that you want to cut out before you cut them out to make it a little bit easier. After the ends have been cut out and bent over, it's ready to paint. So I'm using some of the opaque white plastic canvas, but you can buy it with different colors like the black. So you might not have to paint it if you can find the black. So here's an example of the rack that has the end cut out, and the other one has the rack that I did not cut out those supports. So it works fine bending the ends either way. I'm using a matte black acrylic paint. I only use one coat to paint the canvas of the cooling rack. I paint the top, the bottom, the sides, and I get in between all the squares. And I do about half of the cooling rack. Then I put it in clamps to let that dry. And when it's dry, I move the clamps to the painted side and paint the other side. Once it's dry, take a look at it from the front, the back, and the sides, just to make sure you didn't miss a spot. And if you did, touch it up with some more paint. The second from the right, I made from a black canvas. I didn't have to paint that one. For the smaller scales, I use black construction paper, and I cut them into rectangles. I take a tweezers and I bend the ends down instead of using the plastic canvas. As you can see with the smaller scales that I've already made, I do have a piece of the foil that I've glued on the top for the flat pan, but you can see the little legs or the edges that have been turned down on the angle. I do that for all the sizes. The baking flat sheet pan is made from a silver foil cardstock. It's a little shiny here. I cut rectangle shapes to fit on top of the cooling racks. This silver foil cardstock just has the silver part on top, and underneath it just has a white base, which I think is okay. You could also cut a silver rectangle shape a little bit larger than the cooling rack to be placed underneath it, or the cooling rack, as a crumb catcher. Next, I take a small stylus end and a straight edge, and then the foil rectangles, and I just create little lines all around the perimeter of each of the rectangles to give it a decorative edge or the impression of an edge. And you could also clip the corners just a tiny little bit with your scissors or craft knife, just to kind of round the ends. After making the cooling racks and the baking flat sheet pans, I'm ready to make the baking mats. For the larger scale baking mats, I'm using the textured piece of the vacuum food seed bag. It has two parts. One piece is smooth and then the other piece has the texture on it. You can use other materials. I was just trying to get a silicone matte look. I have the backing of a laminate sheet that had some texture that I kept that could also be used too. To make the framed edge, I use construction paper. I cut a rectangle to match the textured piece size, then cut out the interior, and then glue it to the textured piece. But first, I take a marker, a tan marker, and then I just color the textured, food saver wrap. I let that dry good before I glue it to the little mat. This is the 1/12 scale baking mat, and you can measure it to see if you can get the right sizes, or you can just line it up with the silicone baking mat and trim it to size. I do like to take off the little corners just to kind of round it a bit. Then I take the craft knife and carefully cut out the interior of the rectangle, making a frame for the baking mat. Trim any interior pieces with scissors if needed, or the craft knife. You could actually cut two pieces or two frame pieces and put the silicone mat in between them when you glue them. I just thought it might be a little bit too thick, so I only did one side. Next, I glue around the edges of the frame, and then I press it onto the little textured baking mat, and then I press it to shape, or press it to the edges, and let it dry. You could also paint the edges or use a permanent marker to draw the lines on the textured baking mat. For the smaller scales baking mats, I use the side edges of the vacuum food bag. It has a smaller texture. To make the edging, I place the edges in paint and just kind of run it along the edge, and then I hold it with the tweezers until it dries. You could also use a permanent marker for the smaller baking mat edges. For the oven mitts and the hot pan holders, I use fabric, non-woven craft sheets, paper, and paint. Cut to size and shape. If using fabric, apply a light coat of glue. Let it dry before you cut it out to keep it from fraying. You can use paint, paper punches of flower shapes or leaves to decorate. And for the 1/12 scale, I used a dark green on one side, and on the other side I used the fabric. I hope you like and share this project, making a miniature cooling rack, a flat pan, a baking mat, and oven mitts. Thank you so much for watching.